respected and renowned commentators are talking about the prospect of the current confrontation, like in 1914, potentially escalating from what seems like a very localized war to a regional war and then later something much bigger. One of those who've written about this is Gidon Rachman, the chief foreign affairs commentator at the Financial Times. Mr. Rachman's commentary is read very carefully all across the world in many world capitals. So I invite Mr. Rachman to join us on the news track to talk about why he fears that there are some similarities, potentially, there could be, which we need to be aware of and keep our eyes open to, about what happened in Sarajevo in June 1914 and what we're seeing currently in Gaza. So Mr. Rachman, welcome and thank you for your time.
A pleasure.
Could you start by reminding all our viewers about what happened with the Austrian Archduke in Sarajevo in June 1914 and the kind of similarities that you seem to be picking up and why we need to be very worried about what's happening now and shouldn't just be seen as a conflict between the Hamas and Israel, because this could soon, in your view, if things aren't controlled, escalate into something much bigger. So why are you so apprehensive about what may happen next?
Sure. Well, I should say it's not really just my view. I mean, basically, was talking to policymakers, particularly in America, about how they're seeing this conflict. And it became clear to me that their major preoccupation, is to stop this becoming a regional conflict that drags in Iran and the United States. They are, of course, trying to de-escalate the situation in Gaza, support Israel, but also, push for fewer civilian casualties, humanitarian access, and all of that. But within that context, they are very worried that the next stage in this conflict, and probably the biggest U.S. interest, is to avoid it going regional. And the reason I mentioned 1914 in the column I wrote is that that's a sort of classic case, which I think historians, political scientists have been fascinated with for the last century, because it starts with a terrorist outrage, an assassination. It looks like at the time something that's very confined to Austria and Serbia, but then you then discover that really quite quickly, 5 or 6 weeks, it escalates into a conflict that includes Great Britain and therefore also actually India, but France, Russia, Germany, and so on. And the interesting thing about that crisis that unfolded over 6 weeks was that most of the countries involved did not actually want a general European war, but they kind of got dragged into it as various thresholds to international action were crossed. So that, for example, the Russian and German emperors, who were related, exchanged numerous messages during that month of August 1914 saying, we really mustn't allow this to become a war between Russia and Germany, but at a certain point, both countries feel so threatened that they end up at war. And the analogy, I think, with what's happening now is that you can see, for example, unprecedented conversations between the leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, he's the de facto leader, and President Raisi of Iran. These are not people who've spoken to each other for decades, but speaking to each other. And in some ways, that's a hopeful sign, but it also shows how anxious they are that this could escalate. And similarly, when Blinken, the US Secretary of State, went to Jerusalem, he didn't just meet the Israelis, he then went on a whole tour of the region, because he can see this is a conflict with regional implications. And we can go into this in more detail, how it could spin up. But I think the central vector is that a lot of the kind of actors are proxies for Iran.
Okay, so let's deal with it one by one. Because the biggest question is, can Iran get militarily involved, either directly or through its proxies? What's your understanding at this moment of Iran's threshold? Ibrahim Raisi, the country's president, has spoken about crossing red lines that force everyone to take action. You've written about this. What's your understanding of what Iran's real thresholds seem like at this moment?
Well, that is the key question. And of course, Raisi, if he takes to Twitter, is doing something particularly. He's positioning himself publicly. The Iranians will also be having private conversations indirectly with the Americans via Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and so on. And whether what they say publicly and privately are the same is not always the case. But I think that, taking a step back, Iran's kind of positioning is that it is the leader of what they call the axis of resistance to Israel. It wants to be the rallying point for all those who do not accept the right of Israel to exist. And it's important at a time when Saudi Arabia, its traditional regional rival, its neighbor, was moving towards normalization with Israel, was about to restore diplomatic relations, according to both the Israelis and the Saudis, and other Gulf states, the UAE, Bahrain, etc., had already done that. So for Iran, this is both a challenge and an opportunity. They need to show that they are the true voice of the Palestinian resistance. But that also creates a dilemma for them, because if, as Israel bombards Gaza, kills a lot of civilians, as we saw only yesterday, the pressure then turns back on Iran, because people say, well, you say, that you're the great defenders of the Palestinians. What are you doing? And that is what Raisi was referring to when he said, the red lines are being erased very quickly. And finally, Hamas is one thing, but the biggest and most powerful Iranian proxy is Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, possibly the most powerful force in Lebanon, extremely well armed.